Hey everybody, this is Ready State Loop, and I'm Justin.
I'm Eric.
And today, we're looking at Nintendo.
You may have noticed that we have not included Nintendo in our conversations about the upcoming console war, mostly focusing on Microsoft and Sony. The reason that we're doing that is that Sony and Microsoft are in a bit of an arms race for, the centerpiece of your console entertainment system. But Nintendo really hasn't been a part of that conversation since the GameCube era. They seem to be taking a different route from the Microsoft and the Sony. And given that Microsoft and Sony are in this console war and Nintendo seems to be doing their own thing, how do they compete? How are they contributing to the games industry? How are they remaining profitable in a game industry where there are two heavyweights that do not include them in their number?
To better understand Nintendo's sort of overall strategy, we should probably take a look at Nintendo historically. So where did Nintendo start? Historically, Nintendo's always been a playing card company. They've been making cards since the 1800s, and they even continue to do it today. But the Nintendo that we all know didn't start until like the 70s. So exactly how did Nintendo get into games?
It's pretty interesting. They started dabbling with some of the toys early in the 60s and 70s, the 1960s and 1970s. And that led them into doing kind of arcade cabinet style games. A lot of those were published by Sega, of all people. By the 1980s, they had done some experiments and ended up building their own kind of handheld games, along with the Game & Watch series. They had the NES, known as the Famicom, that really started to take off in around 1983. And in the US, it landed as the NES in 1985, right after the US game industry crash. So that
Since
the NES came out, they seemed to really double down on the games industry and have consistently created new devices onto which to create games and release games. Which brings us to the question of, are they profitable? How successful have they been in this endeavor?
Yeah, Nintendo's kind of been an oddball here because Nintendo, although started like the core of what the game business is today, they branched off and they became profitable in their own way. And although it shares some of the core businesses that all three of the companies use, Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo, they've sort of paved their own way with the way that they generate money now. If you look through their entire history, there's only been two periods in which they weren't unprofitable, where they actually posted losses. And that was during the GameCube and then the Wii U, the latter parts of the Wii U. And that's the only time that they actually lost money. Other than that, they generate enough money so that they can run solely a games division and still be a profitable company that trades on the stock market and does well. So that kind of hints at a couple ideas, but really it comes down to is, what is their actual business? How do they differentiate themselves from Sony and Microsoft?
The thing to note about Nintendo is that their huge profit driver for them is their IP. And they, of the three, Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo, really do the best job of leveraging their own IP on their own console. The consoles themselves are just vehicles through which to sell their content. Yes, they allow third parties and they invite third parties to create games for their consoles. However, the number of first-party titles that they push and the quality that they push really shows that is where their focus is. The consoles are there to showcase their IP. The reason for this is that, a game sold on their own console, where they're the publisher and the developer, will net them $20 to $30 on a standard priced game. Whereas if you're a third party on a platform, you're going to make a whole lot less than that on every title sold.
Yeah,
so your
Nintendo
profits
only makes around $7 to $15 on a third party published game.
Yeah, so they do a lot better when their first party games succeed.
Now, Nintendo actually, compared to Sony or Microsoft, they have a huge attach rate with their internally published games. So if you look at Sony or Microsoft, they only see about 15% of the total user base adopting one of their titles. So if you look at like PS4, for instance, there's about 120,000 of those sold. And you look at a game like God of War, Uncharted, those are selling somewhere between 10 and 15 million a piece. Now compare that to Nintendo. They're seeing about 30% of their total user base picking up any one of their titles. So let's take, for instance, the Switch, right? Switch has, I think, 60 to 70 million units sold. And Mario Kart 8 on the Switch has sold 26 million units. That's huge profits on a single game, which Sony and Microsoft failed to generate on any one of their given games.
One of the key things to point out about this strategy, though, is that it's very easy to overdo it. Nintendo is very good about spacing out the titles that they have. Like, you won't see a mainline Mario game except once every 4 or so years. Zelda is even longer between each game. So there's not an oversaturation, and that allows them to keep their prices relatively high. So they're continuously making money during that period.
You don't see the same sort of game fatigue that you would from, say, EA or Activision, or even, like Ubisoft to some degree. Usually those companies will find the title that hits hard, and then they just pump it out. You saw that with Assassin's Creed, where every year was a new title, and then the sales numbers just dropped. Once the game's fatigued, it's really hard to generate interest in your games again.
If they're managing that, how are they set up to do that versus their competitors? Because we mentioned EA, and we mentioned Activision, Sony. What is the difference there?
Let's take, for example, EA. The typical model for a large publisher like that is to have their main headquarters, which is in Redwood City. They'll also have major corporate offices that will focus on things like global testing or marketing. Those might be located in LA. But then you have all these other smaller studios that they've consumed over, a decade or two. So like BioWare, Visceral, DICE, all these companies, and they still exist, and they'll task them to either support other titles or, be the lead of a brand new title. Nintendo doesn't operate like this. They have their major studio headquarters. So there's one in Europe, there's one in Seattle, Washington, and then there's one in Japan, as their like core corporate offices. But they also do a ton of game development in there. And then you have a few satellite offices that were the case of them consuming, retro studios, for instance, or having small like task-based teams like HAL Laboratories. But other than that, they're largely concentrate most of the development from within their headquarters studios.
That also gives them a really strong opportunity. Because everything is in-house, it allows them to also have a very flexible game development model. And the teams themselves internally are extraordinarily flexible. They will task a group of developers to say, you are now a team. We think this is a cool idea. Go workshop it. And they'll have several of these working in parallel. Frequently, they'll work with one IP in mind, for instance, Zelda, and they'll say, if we made a Zelda game around this concept, what would that be like? How far can we push this as a core mechanic for this game? And they'll work on it for upwards of sometimes even years. And it may or may not actually reach, maturity into something that they think they can push into a full game or make a piece of a game. Sometimes that's where you get, Nintendo's canceled games. Sometimes a mechanic that was developed for Zelda might show up in a Mario game. And this kind of almost development soup is something that Nintendo really excels at, and that lets them really push the quality, because a lot of that development will bubble up and become something that they can take and apply to any of their IP, and allows them to be flexible in that way. So they're very fortunate in that manner, and they're very good about not trying to force a solution. which results for us in quality games.
Their strength is that they're more of like a prototyping studio that happens to make games out of the prototypes, whereas someone like EA or Sony will take one of their major IPs and we're like, we need to make a God of War game, and it needs to be reinvented. And it's not to say that they won't do a bunch of prototyping to get to the point where they have new solid gameplay mechanics that make your God of War, but it's like purpose focused opposed to create until you come up with something that's interesting, and then you have Miyamoto over your shoulder going like, yeah, maybe you should do this a little bit differently.
Nintendo's history of strong IP, their ability to, with their small team focused and rather than studio focused development process, and their ability to publish titles for their own, very popular titles for their own consoles, allows them to really drive profits with what is a relatively concise model.
Now the question still remains, which is like, how sustainable is this? And
right,
there's clear shifts in the way the market and the game industry is changing over this next generation. It's unclear exactly what this means for Nintendo, but it remains to be seen whether they have to stick with the things that have worked for them for the past 30 years or pivot.
They've already shown that they are willing to produce content for other platforms. They have a handful of mobile games, not mainline games, but has given them experience in that market.
But I mean, even if Nintendo is at some point forced to become just a publisher for another platform, I think we can rest assured that the way that they've developed their studios and their sort of the foundation to what makes Nintendo a great company will mean that we will still be getting like these great games for decades to come, even if it's not from a next Nintendo platform. And with that said, I think we're at the end of our video. I hope you liked our content. If you want to see more of it, let us know what you want to see. We'll cover just about anything. We're just tell us what you want.
Please. What do you want? We'll do whatever it takes.
Anything. Just view our videos, please. I'm gonna have to sell my house.
You have a house?
Well, it's a couple pieces of cardboard and this really nice backsplash I got that's on a green screen. Subscribe to us.
You can afford that. Look at mine.
Yours is just wainscoting behind you, and that's it.
Yeah, I have yellow slatted walls here. It's great. And what looks like a printer, but is actually just, a box of a printer.
Yeah, anyway. Everything. It's a house of cards around us.
That's right.